I'm going to argue in this video that John 10 is not a good proof text for limited atonement. In fact, not only does the logic of the libertarian fail at a couple key points, but certain interpretive details are often overlooked, details that cut against it. Now look, I've been swimming in the waters of this debate for a long time now, so I know there's a lot of passion surrounding this issue, and I know it can be hard to listen to someone challenge long-held beliefs. So I ask for your patience and a measure of trust. I want to handle this fairly. I want to convince you, which means that I need to handle this carefully, representing the logic of limited atonement to your full satisfaction. So with all that said, this video will be divided into two main sections. In the first section, we're going to look at the negative inference fallacy and seek to steel man the limited atonement position. Present the best case possible and interact with that version, the best version. Then in the second section, we'll consider a couple interpretive details that often go unnoticed, which impact how we should think about the Good Shepherd discord. Okay, so part one, the logic. Part two, interpretive details. Now, for the logic. In John 10, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And then later, while speaking to a group of Pharisees, he says, you do not believe because you are not among my sheep. Advocates of limited atonement take special notice of this. On the one hand, Christ clearly states that he lays down his life for a certain group of people, namely the sheep. And on the other hand, Christ explicitly demarcates others as not my sheep. So you have sheep and not my sheep. Christ lays his life down for the sheep. Therefore, many Reformed thinkers conclude that Christ didn't die for those who were not his sheep. Now listen, if you're a savvy libertarian, you're going to anticipate an objection at this point, an objection called the negative inference fallacy. What is that? To state it simply, it's just an error in logic. It goes like this. You can't draw a negative conclusion from a positive statement or premise. Okay? You can't draw a negative conclusion from a positive statement or premise. And an illustration will, I think, make this very, very clear. So just imagine premise one would be something like, John loves all the members of his household. Premise two, Sally is not a member of his household. Therefore, John does not love Sally. Now, as you can hopefully tell, the conclusion simply doesn't follow. Sally could be his sister who lives in another household, whom he loves dearly, right? And or maybe it's John's mother, or maybe John is a widow and Sally is his fiancée. Here's maybe one of the easiest ways to just understand this. So consider I say the following statement. I like to pick apples. That sentence is just a simple statement about something I like to do. With that in mind, let's ask a question. Could you discern what I don't like to do from that statement, right? I like to pick apples. Could you discern what I don't like to do from that statement? I mean, of course not. Imagine I tell someone, hey, I like to pick apples. And they say, so you don't like to pick raspberries, huh? I'd be like, no, wait a minute. What made you think that? I do actually enjoy picking raspberries. The negative inference fallacy draws our attention to this error. Okay, premise one, I like to pick apples. Premise two, raspberries are not apples. Therefore, I don't like to pick raspberries. The conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. So, all right, so with this in mind, here's an invalid syllogism from John 10 that you'll see all the time in these discussions. One, Christ lays down his life for the sheep. Two, the Pharisees are not his sheep. Therefore, Christ did not lay down his life for the Pharisees. The conclusion doesn't follow. It's an error. No matter how much you may want it to work, it is the negative inference fallacy. So the only way you could make this work is if you adjust the language. Consider how could we tweak this to where it would be closer to the truth? Consider Christ only lays down his life for the sheep, no exceptions. The Pharisees are not his sheep, therefore Christ did not lay down his life for the Pharisees. This is valid because the word only was used. Without that, it doesn't work. But here's the problem for the libertarian. John 10 doesn't say that Christ only laid down his life for the sheep. It doesn't say that. So what do we do at this point? Let's try to steelman the limited atonement position. So even with this in mind, how might someone try to escape this problem? And so far as I can tell, there's really only one possible escape hatch. Someone could argue that even though the word only isn't used in John 10, it is strongly implied or even necessitated in some way. Now, if any of you have ever heard of the book From Heaven He Came and Sought Her, which is like this big volume defending limited atonement, this is what Jonathan Gibson and Henry Blocker propose, even if only briefly. I mean, I would interact with it, but they honestly, the negative inference fallacy isn't taken up with much detail, and frankly, kind of what they say isn't terribly persuasive. So what I'd rather, for the purpose of this video, I'd rather consider a fuller argument on YouTube by a gentleman by the name of Steve Forkin. And that video is called The Good Shepherd and the Negative Inference Fallacy. In that video, he attempts to provide an illustration where the word only isn't used, but is implied. And here it would be worth considering, since he seeks to tie it into John 10. So let's start with how he tries to present an example where the word only isn't used, but it's strongly implied, therefore necessitating a kind of exclusion. Okay, so here's the illustration. He says, imagine you're at a mechanic's garage getting your tires replaced, and there's a sign on the waiting room that says, "Free coffee in the lounge." Our intuition would immediately recognize that the coffee is only for customers. It's for them only. Even if it doesn't say coffee only for customers, that would be the implied meaning. That's how we would normally understand it. So Mr. Forkin then goes on to imagine a drunkard coming off the street wanting some of the coffee. The owner could rightly say, "Look, I'm sorry, but no coffee for you, just customers." Okay, so this is the general idea. The phrase "free coffee in the lounge" should naturally be understood as free coffee in the lounge for customers only. Thus, this would provide an example of an implied exclusivity. But here's the problem, and interestingly, it's a problem that Mr. Forkin himself recognizes, because right after laying out the illustration, he says, quote, "Now, of course, he," the shop owner, "might be generous and give him a cup of coffee. This is not an issue of generosity here. We're dealing with the negative inference fallacy." End quote. So, but hold up. That concession precisely illustrates the non-exclusivity of the coffee. It is not only for paying customers, all right? His exception illustrates precisely that point. It's not only for paying customers if the shop owner is generous. So let's put it in a syllogism. Premise 1, coffee is for paying customers. Premise 2, John is not a paying customer. Therefore, the coffee is not for John. No, The coffee could be for John, the drunkard, out of generosity, or for John, let's say the owner's brother, or for an old friend who stops by, or maybe there's a special promotional event meant for passerbys that week. Even an implied meaning isn't, this is key, necessarily or absolutely exclusionary. The negative inference fallacy continues to hold. So, with all this in mind, kind of the steps that we're working through trying to steelman this, is there still a way to get around this? I mean, can we come up with an illustration that evades the negative inference fallacy, that somehow supplies an implied absolute exclusion? Here's one I came up with, but it's one that you might think is successful at first blush, but actually, once we kind of probe into it, the negative inference fallacy is going to continue to hold. So imagine two military men. Let's say you have Gary and Stan. Imagine Gary saying to Stan, "I would lay down my life for my friends." And then with a pointed finger at Stan, Gary says, "And you're not my friend. So I'd lay my life down for my friends. You're not my friends." Now here there might seem to be an implied implication. I mean, Gary just said that Stan isn't his friend, and sharply. So the question is, doesn't that strongly imply that Gary wouldn't die for Stan? But again, not necessarily. Imagine Gary immediately going on to say, "Even though you're a worthless piece of trash, I'd still lay my life down for you. Since you're part of the unit, I would do that. I'm an honorable soldier. I would lay my life down even for a scumbag like yourself." The negative inference fallacy continues to hold even when Gary explicitly says that Stan is not his friend. The simple fact is that there could be other factors that come into play. Factors that cut against exclusivity, right? So, what is left for the libertarian? I mean, is there anything else he could do to try to tighten the screws down on this and get that exclusivity that we need? Well, kind of. Yes, kind of. I don't think this is ultimately going to be helpful. But for the sake of showing how someone might try to get around this, let me sketch out a couple ideas. All right. So here's the first one. Premise one. Let's imagine you have a premise like this. The elect are those who will be saved. Premise two. John is non-elect. Conclusion. Therefore, John will not be saved. As you can see, this commits the negative inference fallacy. However, the definition of the word elect could entail an exclusionary note, depending on how you define it. So if we understand the word elect to mean something like those and only those without exception who will be saved, then we're getting closer to meeting our objective. You have to imbue these words with specific definitions to obtain exclusivity. For example, here would be some of the key assumptions that you'd have to have in place for this to work. One, there are only two categories of people, elect and non-elect. Number two, the non-elect cannot become elect, and the elect cannot become non-elect. And then three, the non-elect will not be saved, only the elect will be saved. In this instance, the word elect harbors the idea of only, right? Thus providing a rigid framework, an exclusionary frame of reference. The word only has to be baked in explicitly. If all of that happens, this gets you near the mark. But here's the thing. We've ended up adding the word only to the discussion. You have to get that word in there. You have to spell out the assumptions and insert the word only into the discussion somewhere. The premise, the elect are those who will be saved. has to turn into the elect are those who will only be saved, no exceptions. So I hope you're still with me. What we're trying to do is think through the negative inference fallacy and try to figure out a way how the libertarian could arrive at an absolute exclusion or a necessary implication. So, in light of all this, what does this mean for John 10? It means that when we come to John 10, the context does not provide an absolute exclusion. It's simply not there. The phrase, I lay down my life for the sheep, will not allow a person to say, I only lay down my life for the sheep. Outside texts would have to inform us. They'd have to create an inexorable level of constraint, which is just to say the data would have to incredibly compel us to insert the idea of absolute exclusivity into John 10. But that's precisely the rub. I would argue that when we look at these, when we look at outside texts, we learn that Christ suffers for the sins of humanity. Yes, there's a special divine intention for the elect, but there's also a loving provision made on behalf of humanity. That's what an unbiased reading of the data should cause us to affirm, in my opinion. So to say it again, and this is important, John 10 does not say anything decisive about the extent of the atonement because, one, there could be a special sense in which Jesus lays down his life for the sheep, or there could be a broader reason why Jesus lays down his life for the non-sheep, or perhaps John 10 is a matter of emphasis to make a point. Any of these could come into play. So, let's summarize what we have so far. When it comes to the negative inference fallacy, it continues to hold firm. John 10 does not allow us to insert the word only in an absolute sense given the data found in John 10. A person would have to go elsewhere to somehow establish that. But that's just the problem. John 10 on its own, please note that, on its own does not prove or even necessarily imply limited atonement. Logic requires us to admit this. Now, in terms of the purpose of John 10, I'd like to say more about that in the next section, and we're almost there. I know this is waxing on a bit long on this whole syllogism thing, but I think it's really important. Before we do that, in terms of the purpose of John 10, let me just add a couple interesting tidbits for consideration that I think come into play too here as we think about the logic and the negative inference fallacy and absolute exclusion. So I want to be brief. So let me move quickly. Let's look at Matthew 15:24. And here Jesus tells a Canaanite woman begging for help, quote, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, end quote. Here Jesus explicitly says that he was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. And yet, when she manifests extraordinary faith, Jesus heals the woman's daughter. Sometimes the Bible will speak in apparent absolutes when in reality is more like a matter of emphasis or focus, or maybe even there's an element of timing for these things. Along these lines, here would be another example. The gift of prophecy in 1 Corinthians 14:22b, which reads, prophecy is a sign not for unbelievers, but for believers. That is a pretty black and white conclusion Paul draws, and yet, just a handful of verses later, he provides an example of how prophecy can work powerfully for an unbeliever. See verses 24 and 25. So, I think it's worth noting that a strong statement can be nuanced by other unspoken factors. As is so often the case with theology, various concepts interlace, creating distinctions in various senses. A biblical author can highlight or even emphasize a point without feeling the need to immediately qualify that statement with an array of scholastic distinctions, even though such distinctions may exist. For this reason, we have to be careful drawing unwarranted conclusions from John 10. All right? We have to be careful drawing unwarranted conclusions from John 10. We have to beware of overreach. All right, enough of that. Let's move on to part 2, interpretive details in John 10. And for this, let's start with the verse everybody wants me to go to, which is John 10:26. It reads, "You do not believe because you are not among my sheep." Many Calvinists, when they read this passage, hear it saying something like the following: "You do not believe because you're not elect," or "Since you are non-elect, this is the reason why you do not believe." Here, unconditional election takes center stage, and as such, it subtly controls the interpretation. But what if that isn't what Jesus intended to communicate? What if something else is being emphasized? Now, I'm actually quite excited to share this because I think once you see it, once I kind of lay out some of these other factors that come into play, I think you'd be like, oh, okay, look, that's actually really helpful. And it does line up with a larger theological point John wants us readers to see. Now, to state it up front before offering evidence, I think Jesus intends to communicate something more like the following in 10:26. You do not believe because your heart is all wrong. You think you know God, but if you knew my Father, you would recognize me. You're not among my sheep. You're not a follower of Yahweh. This explains why you obstinately refuse to recognize even the miracles I do in my Father's name. That's why you don't believe. This theme saturates John's gospel, especially the chapters leading up to chapter 10. Over and over again, Jesus tells the religious leaders and various other Jews that they do not know God. They think they know God, but they don't. They're confident that God is their Father, but in reality, if they knew God, they would recognize Christ as God's Son. But they don't. They keep refusing to believe him. They keep rejecting his miracles and teachings. Now, let's look at some passages in this regard. We're going to work through some text leading up to John 10 that just sets this theme. All right, so let's start with John 5:37 and 38. "And the Father who sent me has himself borne witness about me. His voice you've never heard, his form you've never seen, and you do not have his word abiding in you, for you do not believe the one whom he has sent." And then in 5:42 and 43, "But I know that you do not have the love of God within you. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him." Okay, so in John 7:28, if we move up, "So Jesus proclaimed as he taught in the temple, 'You know me, and you know where I come from, but I have not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you do not know.'" Then later in John 8:19, they said to him, therefore, "Where is your Father?" Jesus answered, "You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also." Then John 8:42 and 43, Jesus said to them, "If God were your Father, you would love me, for I came from God and I am here. I came not of my own accord, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot bear to hear my word." And then in 8:46 and 47, this is an important one. "Can any of you prove me guilty of sin? I am telling the truth. Why don't you believe me? He who belongs to God hears what God says. The reason you do not hear is that you do not belong to God." And lastly, in John 8:54 and 55, Jesus answered, "If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say, 'He is our God.' But you have not known him. I know him. If I were to say that I do not know him, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him, and I keep his word." Over and over again, Jesus confronts the Jews who think they know God but do not. Even the religious leaders, who of all people should know God, do not. And one of the proofs is that they refuse to come to Christ. So when we look at a verse like John 10:26, Jesus is yet again pressing this point home. They do not believe because they're not among his sheep. Those who are part of God's true flock recognize the voice of Christ. They don't recognize the voice of Christ, therefore they're not true followers. They aren't real believers. This means that the text isn't making an overt statement about election or reprobation. That may be hovering somewhere in the background, but it's not in the foreground. We need to rightly parse the meaning of 1026 because, again, these details should control our paradigm rather than our paradigm controlling the text. Okay, that's the first observation. Let's look at another observation. Pretty much everyone agrees that Ezekiel 34 serves as a backdrop for John 10. And when we look at Ezekiel 34, a few noteworthy things emerge, okay? So if we were to go, I'm not going to go all just like verse by verse through Ezekiel 34. Here's just, I think, 3 things that we can say that everybody should agree on. Number 1, God pronounces judgment on the shepherds of Israel because they're not doing what they ought, okay? Number 2, in response to this, God says that he is going to directly shepherd his people. I will feed them with good pasture, he says. I myself will be the shepherd of my sheep, and I myself will make them lie down. I will seek the lost, I will bring back the strayed, and I will bind up the injured, and I will strengthen the weak. Over and over again, God says that he's going to do what the false shepherds failed to do. And then number 3, interestingly, God declares that his judgment is going to divide sheep from sheep. Quote, therefore, thus says the Lord God to them, behold, I myself will judge between the fat sheep and the lean sheep, because you push with side and shoulder and thrust it all the week with your horns till you have scattered them abroad. I will rescue my flock. They shall no longer be a prey, and I will judge between sheep and sheep. Now, when we come to John 10, we have the religious leaders doing a terrible job, much like the unfaithful shepherds of old. Just a chapter earlier in John, the Pharisees questioned a man healed of blindness, and they refused to accept his testimony and finally threw him out. If you look at John 9:34, it says, they answered him, you were born in utter sin and you would teach us, and they cast him out. After their treatment of the man born blind, Christ's words in John 10 should sting all the more. They are not tending to the sheep. They complain about healings on the Sabbath. They are jealous of Christ's ministry. They are proud. They are man-pleasers, etc., etc. So when Jesus stresses that he lays down his life for his sheep, he says this to not only condemn the ministry of the Pharisees, who thought they were great, but also to highlight the goodness of his ministry. He is the true shepherd who really does care about the sheep, unlike them. In the same way that the unbelieving Pharisees were Abraham's offspring according to the flesh, Jesus can say, if you were Abraham's children, then you would do the things Abraham did. John 8:39. Similarly, they were part of the flock of God in one very real sense. But in another sense, they were not part of the flock. As God said in Ezekiel, I will judge between sheep and sheep. These religious leaders were in profound danger. They were in the process of being cut out of the olive tree. They were being told that they did not really know God as their father. They were being told that Christ was the promised shepherd to come in Ezekiel, that he was Yahweh. God said, I will, over and over again. And here you have Christ saying, I am the good shepherd. He is the one to whom they should have looked. As the good shepherd, Christ sternly warned these men while also inviting them to enter through the gate to be saved. Or as he says in verses 37 and 38, Do not believe me unless I do what my Father does. But if I do it, even though you do not believe me, believe the miracles, that you may know and understand that the Father is in me and I in the Father. John 10 is not about the extent of the atonement, neither directly nor indirectly. It is a glorious statement about Christ's ministry while also functioning as an indictment against the Pharisees. They thought they knew the Father, but they did not. If they did, they would have recognized Christ's voice as the true shepherd. They thought they were righteous leaders, faithfully obeying God. But when the Messiah himself was standing before them, doing miracle after miracle and teaching true doctrine, they scorned it, thus revealing the condition of their hearts. One might say that they were wolves in sheep's clothing, much like Saul of Tarsus. But he was a wolf that was transformed, right? He was a wolf that was transformed. He went from not among my sheep to among my sheep by believing. In the end, John 10 is not a proof text for a limited atonement. You can't draw any decisive conclusions limiting the atonement. The negative inference fallacy prohibits it. Full stop. And when other interpretive details are brought to bear upon John 10, a verse like 10:26 isn't especially helpful for the libertarian either. The truth is that the Bible is clear about the extent of the atonement. Some texts clearly teach that Christ suffered for the sins of the world, and it is also clear that Christ's ministry is specially tuned, if you will, towards believers or the elect. There's a special intention and a special purpose there. And I think a good summative text that captures both of these would be 1 Timothy 4:10. And I think I'll just read this in closing. 1 Timothy 4:10, it says, "For to this end we toil and strive, because we have our hope set on the living God, who is the Savior of all people, especially of those who believe."